Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Live from the Blue Seats. This is producer JL coming at you with a solo episode. I guess that's the surprise for now. I tried to see if I could wrangle someone to come on and talk hockey, but lives are busy. Summer's kind of popping, as the kids like to say. I cannot believe I just said that. But yeah, it's just going to be me with you guys here today. Rob is taking care of his kids, doing his family thing. And Dave is on vacation in Florida right now. Although I don't know why anyone would vacation in Florida, but I'm sure Dave has a really good reason to do that. I think he's visiting family, but it is Florida at the end of the day. So it'll just be me answering your questions. So we really don't have like much of a topic to talk about. We're going to try and save some of these episodes for you guys, the listeners. So this is another summer mailbag, so to speak. Obviously, if something does come up within the next couple of days, we'll be here to talk about it. But as for right now, we just wanted to take your questions and devote some of these episodes primarily to what you guys want to ask us. Obviously, it's the beginning of August, so things are beginning to slowly kind of come out in just terms of teams getting ready, and we'll definitely see a lot more news coming out towards the end of the month, going into September as camp begins to kind of slowly begin to put its way together. It's definitely a weird time for the Rangers, and I'm sure some of this will be addressed in some of the questions, but it's definitely a weird time for the Rangers, as we've all kind of talked about. Um, I think what the thing is that they're just trying to really just kind of get back to some respectability after last season's debacle. So, all right, let's jump right into the questions. It's kind of odd not making fun of Dave for the first couple of minutes of this podcast. So, first, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out to actually send us some questions. Um, you know, either on Twitter, Blue Sky, and definitely on the website. You guys are the best. And again, I will always reiterate this. You guys are the lifeblood of this podcast, and we thank you for tuning in and taking a ride on our little podcast amongst the big world of media. All right, so uh, let's just get right into it. So this first question, this is on Twitter. This comes from Kevin at Spozo211, and he asks, "It's all but perfect on paper, but say Gavrikov and Fox don't work out. What is the best alternative?" Well, I know we essentially discussed that to a degree, and I'm trying to remember exactly how we addressed it, but I think what Dave or Rob wanted to do was put Gavrikov with someone like Schneider, possibly, and then maybe put Fox with or maybe put Fox with Schneider, or Gavrikov with a guy like Will Borgen. Um, Will Borgen is definitely somebody to watch on this team. I'm not saying that Will Borgen's going to be a top prime defenseman for this team, but he played well enough on a pretty suspect defensive squad last year to where he could be somewhat usable. I do think the pair will be Gavrikov and Fox. I don't think not Laviolette. I'm so such a knee-jerk reaction to say that. I don't think Sullivan would pretty much deviate from that. I think they signed Gavrikov to be Fox's D partner, so I don't necessarily think it's going to happen. But if they do decide to go away from Gavrikov and Fox, I think it'll probably be Schneider or Borgen that will end up taking that spot. So that's just what I think with that question. I can't really see them going anywhere else with it. But I mean, honestly, who really knows? Honestly, that's kind of a thing that you'll have to just kind of wait and see until camp comes and see how Sully decides to work with his pairings. And then also too, there's the whole rule of certain players are only allowed to play a certain amount of times. And I think with the preseason not being as big as it was in the past, I think that will, really get a good feel of that as the season begins to start. But thank you, Kevin, for that question. This next question comes from Blue Sky. This comes from the Gerard Gallant slander account at allentanderson.bsky.social. Again, I absolutely love this name. Thank you for your question. So he asks, so my friend and I are really high, both are really high on Adam Sikora, honestly to an absurd extent. Are there any prospects you have or have that had that excuse me, are there any prospects you have or have has that almost fanatical attachment to at some point? Well, first of all, thank you for the question. And I want to say that I did have that same sort of uh, expectation of Philip Hedel when he started. I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before that when Hedel came up, I thought he was probably the best pick of the draft that year. And obviously, it ended up turning out to be that way because Elias Anderson ended up turning into a bust. But I just thought, just looking at a guy like Hedel, he was the guy that I thought was going to be, somewhat of a breakout star. And Hedel did have a lot of success here. Let's not kid ourselves. Even though we traded him for JT Miller and he didn't really get a chance to win a cup here, Philip Hedel had a very, injured, yes, but Filipino was very successful here. He was one of the first prospects I kind of had a very similar feeling to. Um, I do have the same expectation of Adam Sikora as you and your friend do. Um, I really like the pick um, because, especially after they drafted Will Cooley, I feel like they were looking for a type of player, and I think Adam Sikora, who I think they compared to Brad Marchand in his draft year, I think that Sakura can really be a guy that could be a useful asset for this team because just from reading the scouting report that he's kind of tough, he kind of plays similar to Brad Marchand. He has, somewhat of a scoring touch. I think that that's kind of a player that winning teams have, and I think that he would kind of fit that bill. And I guess another one that I could mention is Brett Berard. There's something about Brett Berard that I guess maybe my expectation of Berard is kind of more than most people think, but I really think Brett Berard can really be sort of, better than what he's putting out right now. Just from going off of the stuff that I've seen in Hartford, and I'm sure Hope will probably have a better, a better report on him in terms of how he was in Hartford from just what I was able to see in terms of what I've caught in terms of just like sort of the things that he's done as a member of the Wolfpack. It just kind of seems like he pretty much has a pretty decent scoring touch and a nose of where to be and where to put the puck into the net. Um, he's got speed, does play very similar to Carl Hagelin, as Dave mentioned in one of our previous episodes. But I think Berard has more scoring or has more of a scoring touch than Hagelin does, which I think makes up for his sort of lack of speed compared to Hagelin. But I really think Brett Berard is really going to be one of those guys that um, will, have a significant impact, and I'm really high on. So I'd probably say Brett Berard. I do understand the Adam Sikora sentiment, um, and yeah, that's pretty much where I stand with those two. So that's my answer to that. I'm really high on Brett Berard. Like I was excited when he scored his first NHL goal. I really think that this kid can be something, worth more than just like a third line player for this team. Um, and I think that's important for this Rangers team to have these guys who can basically come in and fill in secondary scoring roles at the moment. Because obviously, primary goes to, you know, Zibanejad, Trocheck, JT Miller, Artemi Panarin, Alexi Lafreniere. Those guys end up performing, then I really think that, Berard will be able to really shine in his role, you know, on this team and really kind of go further out in terms of what his expectation is. So he's definitely one to look out for this year. So thank you for that question. Another question from Blue Sky, and this comes from Alex SK at bsky.social. And Alex asks, Jimmy VC to Geneva on a 2-year contract, the end of his NHL career or a surprise gift from the Genovese expat Rangers fans? Um, hmm, I don't think it's the end of his NHL career. I think I think if a team is looking for an experienced player, he's still reasonably young. I mean, he's not completely old yet, but I just think there was just a lack of opportunity right now. Um, he kind of didn't really have much of an opportunity in Colorado. I don't think he really played as much as he would hope. So I think this is probably a time for him to reset. A lot of those guys that end up going to Europe, they end up coming back within a year or two. So I foresee Jimmy VC kind of coming back. Do I see him as a Ranger? Uh, Probably not. but I think he'll end up on some team as like another third or fourth liner. Honestly, if it weren't for the fact that the Rangers are so loaded with prospects and just, pretty much other options, he would still be here. I would assume that because they did offer him a nice little extension, and that's the reason why he was able to, they offered him that 2-year extension that, he was able to be here. So I just think that he just kind of, the Rangers had other guys, and I think Colorado had other guys too, and it's just one of those things where I guess no one was really offering, and he decided to go take a chance in overseas and just kind of maybe come back within the next year or two, you know. And I guess maybe it's also just a change of experience. It's all those guys end up coming back at some point. Do I think he'll be? I don't think he'll be a Ranger. Maybe he comes back a third time. I don't know. Um, I think VC could fill a role on a Mike Sullivan type of team, but who knows? But I don't think VC is completely gone in the NHL, and I hope that's the answer you were looking for that question. So I apologize if I didn't answer it properly. I don't think he's completely done. It also just depends on how he does over there. If he just all of a sudden becomes a dud over in Switzerland, then yeah, maybe his career is over. But I mean, who knows? He still has a ton of talent. I mean, it's not like he's not a useful NHL. Just sometimes the opportunities in certain times just don't present itself. Maybe he could have held out a little bit more for a PTO, which he could have realistically have gotten, kind of similar to what Connor Sheary got with the Rangers. But maybe he just wanted to have some place where they'd be able to guarantee him some money. Maybe he had some options on the table with some other teams, but decided to go for the guaranteed money overseas. And you also hear that it's really cool to play over in Switzerland, which it's definitely that's one of those places I definitely like to visit in terms of international hockey. So, all credit to Jimmy for, going for some guaranteed money and wish him nothing but the best out there in Sweden and not Sweden in Switzerland. So, no, I think he'll end up coming back at some point. He's not one of those players that his career is totally over. Um, all right, so we're gonna hop on to the blog post and some of the questions. Again, you guys always come through. Um, we are I love the questions that we get here. Um, Definitely have a lot, so have some stuff to talk about. So thank you again, guys, for submitting those. So this first question comes from Captain Jack. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Alex, for that question about Jimmy VC, and thank you, Captain Jack, for this question here. When you three get back together, I think a great podcast will be breaking down the U.S. Olympic roster and its lines. So I'll press you with this, Captain Jack. Uh, Within the next week or two, submit that question again onto the blog because I know for a fact that either Dave or myself or maybe even Rob will be back within the next 2 weeks. So I suggest so that we don't forget, pop that onto another one of our posts or pop it on one of our social media handles, and we'll do our best to try and answer it. I think that would be really good to try and answer before the end of the summer. So thank you, Captain Jack, for that suggestion. This next question comes from G8 Lafreniere. And G8 Lafreniere asks, I don't stay up to date on the social media. Is everyone back yet or still across the globe? I wonder who is traveling the world and which players are working out. I know Mika is probably DJing somewhere. I mean, that is a given. Then he asked, do you agree with Vegas that this team has a better shot at the cup than Washington? Or are you guarded until camp opens and we see what lines and deep pairs Sully comes up with? Follow up is, why don't people like the idea of tanking for McKenna when it could mean a decade or more of finally having a top one seed? So I guess just the first part of this question is everybody back? I don't know. I don't really follow much of what the players do on social media. For all we know, Mika could be DJing and working out at the same time. Generally, that's what these guys do: is they go on vacation and they train. Um, so I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, I know people like to get on Mika about him being a DJ, but he has every right to live his life. It's not. It's also the same when everyone was getting on Lafreniere for playing softball in the summer. But I mean, as long as they're putting in the work, which I know they do, these guys, these players are creatures of habit. They're gonna go and do their workout routine. Um, I know Mika definitely does it. He usually trains in Sweden because if you're making $8.5 million, you can afford to live both in New York and in Sweden, which must be nice. But I think most of the guys are probably doing their own thing. Um, Kreider and a couple other players, Jonathan Quick, Matt Rempe, they're, doing their stuff. Obviously, Kreider's not a Ranger anymore, but he would train consistently in the summer with guys like Berard and uh, Matt Rempe and Jonathan Quick and all that. So I mean, these guys they're very multifaceted people, and honestly, I really think and I know Tyler, um, Mr. Recap, like he'll mention this in one of our exchanges. He said that the long off season will probably be good for this team because you know Berard has the torn labrum. Schneider had the torn labrum. Keandre Miller before he got traded had his shoulder issue. Obviously we probably know Miller and Panarin and a couple other players are probably dealing with some sort of external stuff because even though they'll never say it, they definitely do deal with it. These guys are constantly putting their bodies out on the line, and I think the last two playoff runs really kind of caught up to them to a degree outside of all the shenanigans that happened last season. So they're all probably still working out. Most of the time, I think though a lot of those guys end up coming back late August into September. So, but they're probably either still working out or just enjoying their summers. I know a couple guys ended up getting married, or maybe I'm looking at something else, but these guys usually take that time to kind of do both. In terms of Vegas having a better shot than Washington, or being guarded about what Sully does, uh, for me personally, I'm not entirely sure what Dave and Rob think. They probably do sort of agree to a degree on this. I think on talent alone, this team does have a better shot than the Capitals. They've improved the defense significantly, just on paper at least. And really, it's not that much of a different team than it was in 2022 outside of the subtractions of Miller, uh, Truba, Kako, and Heedle. I think that if all goes right, this team does have a better shot at the cup than they did last season, and also, a better shot than Washington. Look, the Capitals are a good team. The Metropolitan is kind of up and down, at least in my opinion. You know, the Hurricanes, I think they're just gonna they're we know what they are. The Capitals are this sort of up and coming team. They play hard. Spencer Carberry has those guys really running the gamut just on everything. But they really sort of I don't think they're as dangerous as people think they are. I think their goaltending is a bit suspect. Their defense is definitely a lot better, but that team is built to score goals. But I think that if everything kind of goes to plan and Sully really gets the most out of this Rangers team, then I really think this team does have a better shot at the cup than Washington. Obviously, we want to see what Sullivan does, but I'm willing to give Sully the benefit of the doubt just off of his track record alone. And another thing that's important too, which I alluded to in other episodes of the podcast, is the fact that he has this sort of I don't want to use the word synergy, but it's the only way I can really describe it at the moment, is he has this synergy with Chris Drury. Gerard Gallant and Peter Laviolette ended up having that synergy sort of kind of break after a certain point because they disagreed fundamentally. And I think, Drury finally has the guy he's been coveting for so long. I really think that they're going to be able to really get the most out of each other, which will end up leaking to the team. There was a disconnect between Laviolette and Drury. There was also a disconnect between Gallant and Drury, which I think really caused a lot of external problems that this team didn't need. So I think that, it's kind of a mix of both on that second question, whether or not, you know, they can have a better shot, but you just really need to see what Sully does with the team. If this would have been Laviolette, then we kind of would have had a better idea. But being that he's gone, we just kind of have to see that. And then you ask, why don't people like the idea of tanking for McKenna when it could mean a decade of more finally have a top one? See, well, that's kind of a layered question, and I say that because it's not really much of a guarantee. I mean, if there's ever one thing I know about the New York Rangers is that they're never going to be bad enough to get a good pick, and they're never going to be good enough to get they're never going to be good enough to really win, at least in the current iteration of how the team's been put together. So kind of hoping that the team will tank. First of all, it's not going to be something Jim Dolan would ever really approve. The fact that he was able to approve a rebuild in the past said a lot. And I think that really took a lot out of Jimmy Dolan to really do that. But at least now, with all the money that he spent, not only on the team, but then also with the resurgence of the Knicks, I don't really think he's going to want to see his hockey team flounder again. Say what you want about him as an owner, say what you want about him as his businessman or whatever. He's certainly not the most perfect one, but I can tell you for sure that he would not want to see his hockey product fall over again 2 years in a row and become an NHL embarrassment. So tanking will certainly add to that. Will it make sense for the Rangers to not do well this season to get a high spec for McKenna? Yes, it would. But then also too with, you kind of look at these, cautionary tales of, what happened with, Buffalo and Edmonton with Connor McDavid. Buffalo thought they had it in the bag. Arizona probably thought they had it in the bag at the time for McDavid, and he ended up going to Edmonton. So it's not a guarantee, and and tanking is not really something that I think Ranger fans would essentially be used to. The rebuild has had enough of its fair share of criticism, and some of it was justified because some of those guys they picked during that rebuild were really not, you know, were not great. But I'm not against the idea in a perfect world, but being that it's New York, being that it's the Rangers, being that it's essentially, you know, uh, something they just would never do it. And I mean, maybe somehow they end up making a trade and they ended up getting a pick that ends up having McKenna fall in their lap. I mean, that's essentially, they ended up having the first round pick and Alexis Lafreniere fall in their lap that year due to the COVID season. Um, that's the only reason. That's the only way that happened. And honestly, that's a blessing, regardless of what you feel about Lafreniere and how he could, essentially be a player for this team or not. But, you know, we lucked into that. The same thing with lucking into Chicago, you know. So I think people are against the idea because it's just not something the Rangers ever really did. And they're really not good at tanking either. So anyways, thank you for the question, G8 Lafreniere. These next questions come from NYC Crash. There's a couple here, so I'm going to read them. I'm going to answer them as I go. So these subsections of questions come from NYC Crash. Thank you for your submissions. First one, he asks, do you think Fox and Grav will play on the same line, or will they be placed on separate lines to spread the talent throughout the lineup? I think they signed Gavrikov to be Fox's D pair. And I know we talked about this briefly from the question from earlier from Spozo, but I think Gavrikov and Fox will be on the same line. If they have to adjust, I think Fox and Schneider would be a D pair, and then Grav and Gavrikov and Will Borgen will be, a pairing. If they decide to spread them throughout the lineup, I'm very curious to see how Sullivan handles that. Um, I'm not entirely sure if that's what they want to do, but I really think going into the season, Gavrikov and Fox will be the top D pair, and rightly so because both of them. And let's also not forget, and it just came to me now that they could end up doing that, and actually will have a D pairing of Carson Soucy and Adam Fox. And if you look at the advanced numbers between those two, if they decide that they want to spread the talent throughout the lineup, Fox and Soucy, Schneider Gavrikov, and then you put Borgen with somebody else, maybe Vakanainen or Scott Morrow. It's really not that bad, all things considered. Especially with Schneider coming back from his torn labrum procedure, the longer off season. We might actually see a vastly improved decor, whether or not they're going to be together or not. But I fully believe that Fox and Gavrikov will be on the same line. Second question from NYC Crash is, if you were the GM of the club, what moves would you make before the season starts to improve the team and make us a serious contender? Now, this is kind of the most obvious answer here, but it won't really happen because there really isn't much draft capital to do this with, even with the talent on the roster, so to speak. But if I'm the New York Rangers, I'm going to go out and look for another center. Whether or not that's a number one center or not. Ideally, what you want to end up doing is, if I'm the GM, I'm looking for another 1C or 2C to kind of balance out the lineup. The expectation is that Mika Zibanejad's going to play wing. In some aspects, does that make sense? Probably not. Because you could Mika Zibanejad, you probably still want him to be your number 2 center. Ideally, a winning team has Vincent Trocheck as their number 3 center. That's not a knock on Trocheck, but I think at this point, Trocheck has defined himself as a shutdown center, and Mika is your offensive only center. But with how successful Mika was on the offense, on the wing rather, with JT Miller and Alexis Lafreniere, I think that might get a look at some point. So I think honestly, you ideally you would want to just try to find someone down the middle to kind of fit the 3C or the 2C and slot Trocheck as the 3C. I think Huso Parssinen is going to be a guy on this team, but if he doesn't perform to the level that I think he'll do as a 3C, then I think you have to sort of get some depth in that regard. Um, Parssinen is a guy that I want to see under a Sullivan system. I think that he would do well because you look at the Penguins teams that Sullivan won with, there's a bunch of guys like Parssinen that end up becoming guys and ended up getting good deals too, you know. So uh you would obviously want them to see them try and get a winger because that would really beef them up. But at the same time, you just traded Kreider away. You want to see what you have in Othman. You want to see what you have in Berard. You want to see what you have in Cooley. Give him more minutes. It's that time for Cooley, of course. And, you know, although a winger on paper sounds good, I don't think that's really the case. But there really isn't much else outside of the center position that you can really do to kind of put this team to be a serious contender, unless the deadline comes and there's a glaring need for another winger or to get another center. But it just has to be between the forward top six, another center, another winger. I think that will put this team over the top, but that's more than likely to happen at the deadline. Before the season, it's probably just the center, just to kind of help distribute things out. Gives you flexibility to put Mika on the wing, bolster up your top six. If not, then you try to find a winger that could potentially replicate that production, but also allowing the kids to play a spot on the wing too. It's tough because with the cap going up and certain players potentially being available and not, the Rangers are in this sort of limbo that's like good because they have the room to do it after a certain point, but at the same time it's kind of hard to, there's no real one logical uh answer. Like I'm using another sport for example, like with the Mets, Juan Soto, that was your guy. You had to go all out for him, even if you had to overpay him by like $100 million. But Juan Soto, granted the team's not playing well by the time I record this, but just on paper, you want that sort of prolific hitter in the middle of your lineup with Lindor, Alonso, and Nimmo. So for the Rangers, they're missing that sort of big acquisition. I personally think it should be Connor McDavid. That would just be perfect for this team because then you could put Mika, you know, that, wing, let him ride it out there. McDavid's your number 1 center, JT Miller's your number 2, Vincent Trocheck's your number 3, Connor Carrick is your number 4. So it's pretty much the center position, but that option isn't really available right now. So, but if I had to do it, it would have to be the center. And the number 3, the question is, I know you had some comments below, and I appreciate that because you're absolutely right. Until we draft and develop or trade a 1C, this issue will persist. I agree 100%. So number 3 on NYC Crash's comment, his question is, we seem to only have 2 solid centers in VT, Vincent Trocheck, and Vincent Carrick, and Sam Carrick, not Sam Carrick, Connor, this is Sam Carrick, yeah, Sam Carrick, sorry. Mika has shown capability, but seems more effective on the wing, and JT also performs better on the wing despite being capable at center. How would you arrange this lineup to ensure every player is positioned for success? For example, would you put Mika at 1C with JT Miller, or JT Miller at 1C with Mika on the wing, or would you split them up and have someone else center their line? So I just touched on that previously. I do disagree. I think JT Miller is a very effective center, and he really showed it when he came here again last season. He's your number 1 at the moment, and he's definitely put out what he was doing in Vancouver, probably a little bit better. He's away from all the drama out there, so he's really going to be able to kind of shine on his own. Me personally, I think my personal opinion versus the logical reasoning are two different things. I'm usually pretty logical, but um, I think uh, you put Mika on the wing with JT Miller, and then you have Alexi Lafreniere on the other side, and then you have Panarin, Trocheck, and then another winger with him. Or you can put Mika on wing, Miller at center, and you could put Brendan Othman up with those guys, and then have Lafreniere, Trocheck, and like Will Cooley, which, or you could even put Will Cooley up with Mika. But basically the way that I see it, if Mika's on wing, it's going to be Miller and Mika, and then Trocheck and Panarin. The next the next two lines will sort of kind of figure it out themselves. Obviously, the fourth line is Carrick, Rempe, and Edstrom. So you have some space to work on the third C. But again, like you said, when we don't really have a bona fide 1C, um, and I understand the term, when you use the term bona fide 1C, I understand what you mean. We need a guy like a McDavid or an Eichel. JT Miller is definitely a number one center in most aspects, but um, he would do better as a number two on a Stanley Cup winning team. And I like JT Miller. I do. So thank you for those questions. I appreciate that. We appreciate it as a whole. Um, okay, let's see. This comes from Jeff31, and they ask, how close is Coach going to be with the HC of Hartford? Will he have the ability to suggest, in quotes, their breakouts, power play, PK, and D structure? So this one I'm not really too informed on, although I do know that the organizations try to keep things similar from the farm team to the NHL team. I know that they did that with Ken Jernander and John Tortorella when they were here. So I know with Peter Laviolette and Chris Knobloch, there definitely was some sort of synergy that went along in terms of trying to keep things the same. Obviously, Knobloch has gone to Edmonton and instituted probably a similar system that the Rangers had with Laviolette, and it seems like it's working because they have the right personnel for it. But generally speaking, being that the assistant GM of the NHL team is usually the general manager of Hartford, usually they'll try to have some sort of, this similar sort of thing because they want to be able to call guys up that, you don't want to have to train somebody, to learn a system, you know, in the off chance that they have to fill in and do something for the team. So I'm going to assume that they're probably going to implement similar tactics. Um, I have my thoughts about Hartford and how it's kind of become a bit of an afterthought to a degree, although over the last couple of years they've gotten better with it. But yeah, I'm just going to assume that they're going to have a somewhat decent relationship because if I remember this correctly, and I apologize if I'm off base with this, but I do know that there was communication when Laviolette was here with Knobloch that they were able to, because they have to talk, scouting departments and coaching staffs have to talk to the people down there to see who they're going to call up. You know, Yeah, obviously Chris Drury and Ryan Martin have to know. So I'm assuming because they have to know what's going on, they have to sort of make sure that everything is, um, copacetic in just terms of like knowing the same type of system. So I'm just going to assume that they're probably going to have a decent relationship. Um, I cannot for the life of me come up with the name of who the coach of the Wolfpack is. Let me just look it up real quick. Um, and I apologize in advance. I know Hope would be right on this, but man, I can't. I'm trying to see who the head coach of the Wolfpack is. It's Grant Patolny. I don't know much about Grant Patolny. I know that he did play in the NHL, if I'm correct. Um, he was named last year, so I assume that he is going to be here again. Um, I know that, yeah, he did play in the NHL because I do remember his name. Um, so yeah, so if the fact that Chris Drury named him, I'm just going to assume that they're gonna sort of kind of know what each other's doing. So, yeah, to answer your question, I think they'll have a decent relationship, and they'll probably try to structure a system that's very similar to what Sullivan has in the NHL, because you definitely know for a fact that some of those guys might have to be called up on a whim at some point, and they'll take the summer off to really, kind of put things together. So thank you, Jeff31, for that question. This comes from Nikki70, and Nikki asks, do you think Drury not negotiating with Panarin tees him off? You would have to assume Drury's not going to commit to Panarin with the potential FAs coming to the market. Now, we don't really know if they're really negotiating or not. I certainly don't know. Maybe there's a report that I might have missed that says that, but I don't think that they are afraid of negotiating with Panarin. I have my thoughts about him returning to this team, considering, putting everything into consideration. But there were some sort of news reports going out there that the Rangers were interested in signing him to a shorter term deal for less money after this one ends. But I think of course Drury's gonna look at it. I wouldn't granted he may not be the greatest GM, but he's not an idiot. So you definitely know he's weighing his options, because it's a big group of players that can be incredibly useful, that could fill up a lot of what Panarin can do. And look, Panarin's been great here. All things considered, outside of the stuff that goes on outside of hockey, Panarin has probably been one of the best free agent signings that this franchise has ever had. And putting a lot of my thoughts aside, if the Rangers were to sign him, it's a good hockey move, because you are getting a 90-point player, a 100-point player for a cheaper amount of money, and still have flexibility to go onto the market with the cap going up to sign other players. And you're going to have other contracts coming off the books and this, that, and the fourth. So, um, making an assumption that Drury is not going to commit to Panarin, it just kind of remains to be seen. I don't really know exactly what Drury is trying to do. I just know that he's trying to build the team very similar to the Florida Panthers. But that's not only just the, grit and, crash kind of skill. You gotta have that elite talent, and whatever, however you feel about Panarin and all the other things that happen, Panarin is still an elite talent in the NHL, and he's definitely going to get a sizable amount of money from someone in the market if he hits. So it's kind of hard to tell. I have to see how the season goes, and then you're able to make a determination um, from there. So thank you for that question. So now, um, looking at some of the comments, Earth Yourself has offered a lot of questions here. So these questions are going to be come from Earth Yourself. Thank you for your multiple questions, and I'm going to do my best to try and answer these as best as I can. Are you afraid of 5'9" players? No, I am not. Not me personally. Martin St. Louis is one of my favorites. So is Matt Zuccarello. They have to be good. I'm not afraid of them. I'm hopefully Chris Drury's not either. You don't want to miss out on anyone that could be good just because they're short. And then he asks, would you have put Kreider in long-term injury reserve with this past situation in this season? Yes, I would have. But I think what they were trying to do was up his trade value, and it didn't work. Uh, I think he would have been able to be a little bit more impactful if he wasn't dealing with the back spasms and some other things. So yeah. Uh, what makes a great player in my eyes? Um, skill and leadership. You can only go so far as skill, but I think just in terms of leadership and attitude, I think that kind of takes you a long way. Um, Gretzky certainly had it. A lot of the good players, elite players in this league have it to a degree. They're able to either use their talent to lead or use their attitude to lead. Will you stand up for players against the referees? Well, I mean, this is a pretty pro player podcast. So, I mean, um, and I'm assuming this is all in the guise of, oh, wow, this is in the guise of talking about Sullivan and all that. So again, I'm just trying to answer these the best that I can. I'm guessing this is in reference to talking about Sullivan. Will you stand up for players against the referees? I would hope he would. I certainly would. Will you play players that are hurt during the playoffs, even if you have healthy, capable players on the bench? Um, Conventional wisdom tells you no, but the thing is that it, and I'm thinking just purely as a coach. If the guy can says that he's ready and can push through it, most of the time they're going to say yes. Um, if because if you think about it, depending on who the player is, most of the time this happens, it's usually a player who can make a pretty significant impact. Like you look at the Boston Bruins one year, they had Patrice Bergeron playing with a basically like a collapsed lung, pretty much, or punctured lung, but did well enough to, you know, kill it in the playoffs. Is it ideal? No. I don't think it's a good idea, but I was thinking sure purely as a hockey coach instead of just like a regular person, if they say that they can play, they're going to play. Um, what's the difference between you and Alain Vigneault? Um, and I'm guessing again this is in the guise of Sullivan, Gerard Gallant, and Peter Laviolette, all who made fatal decisions during the playoffs. Um, I guess in terms of, and this is how I'm trying to answer the question. Um, if this is in reference to Mike Sullivan, all three, I mean, all NHL coaches are stubborn to a degree. The best ones are willing to sort of walk away from their stubbornness for the greater good. And I think Vigneault, Gallant, and Laviolette all kind of stuck to their guns. And look, all three of those coaches have had success in the NHL before, so I don't blame them for being stubborn. But at the same time, sometimes staying to their old ways ends up hurting them, and it hurt all three of those guys. I think Mike Sullivan in that aspect has been open more to change, and that's why those Penguins teams were so good because it deviated away from I guess what he wanted to do, but what was the greater good of the team. So that's that. When the Rangers were in the playoffs against Florida, would you have benched Rempe when he was striking fear against the Florida team? Um, I know I had my thoughts on this, and I'm trying to remember what I said. So I apologize if my thoughts aren't consistent with what I said before. Um, that's tough. These are all questions from Earth Yourself, by the way. I'm just running through them to make sure I get to them. Would when the Rangers were in the playoffs against Florida, would you have benched Rempe when he was striking fear against the Florida team? Um, I don't necessarily think a player like Rempe would have really done more or would have done much. They played perfectly fine without him in the lineup. A lot of the big issues that happened between the Panthers were the fact that they just couldn't clear the puck out of their zone defensively. Um, I don't think Rempe at that point was really sort of much of a difference maker in terms of scaring people. I think that was more in the Carolina series than anything, or maybe even the Washington series. I just don't think the Panthers are a really easy team to intimidate. So I don't think benching him or not benching him would have really made much of a difference. Maybe this year could probably be something different because he's definitely a lot better now than he was in that season. That was obviously his first season, of course. Would you give the young players a chance, or are you like the last few coaches who obliviously wasn't? So I guess this is also in the guise of Sullivan. Sullivan is notable for allowing these guys to play and give them time. That's why his Penguins teams were so good. Do you think Brodzinski has a place in this lineup? Who would he replace? Yes, I think he does, and he would probably replace Husso Parssinen and maybe Matt Rempe on a couple of scratches. I think Rempe will have a bigger role this season, so I think it'll probably be more Parson, and I think that he would probably be the third line center. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Brodzinski has proven his worth here as a Ranger. Do you think Rempe and Edstrom are only fourth liners? Rempe, yes. Edstrom, no. I think Edstrom could be a decent third liner. And I think he might get some looks this season depending on how he does. But depending on how good that fourth line is with those two, I think he'll either stay there or get some time on the third line with Will Cooley. He was actually doing really well and actually was playing up on the third line in some aspects before he got hurt. So I think Edstrom has more of a shot to be a third liner. I don't think Rempe is really going to move out of the fourth line spot unless he shows me otherwise. Another question by Earth Yourself is: would you be afraid to use Rempe because the refs are corrupt and want to make a call against the big people who can check in as fast? Well, I think, and again, I'm assuming that this is going to be in the guise of Mike Sullivan, of course. And I apologize in advance if the context was explained at some point on this thread. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm just trying to make sure that um, you know this is done correctly, but I'm just assuming that Earth Yourself is asking these questions in the guise of what will Mike Sullivan do. So if I'm wrong with that, Earth Yourself, please correct me on the next post. But um, would you be afraid to use ramping because the refs are corrupt and want to make a call against big people who can check in as fast? Um, Obviously, there's a target on his back, but I don't think I'd be afraid, or Sullivan would be afraid. I think he has an obvious skill set that he's definitely gotten better at using. Um, I'm one of the biggest Matt Rempe guys out here, and I know that even to a degree, he's kind of misused, his limbs and his body and his timing, but none of it is malicious. So I think that, the more he plays, the more he becomes acclimated. And I think that the Rangers know that. I think Sullivan knows that. And I think that they're not afraid to use him. Um, and then I think this is the last one from Earth Yourself. So thank you again for those questions. I did the best I can to try and answer them. With all the coaches that are around, why pick a coach that's ruined two teams? Do you want a first round pick? Are you sure your leadership can overcome proven deficiency of said coach Quinn? Quinn does not have a good record in the professional league. Why make him an offensive coach when he was a defensive player? Why choose a coach that ruined several young players under his command? Did you notice I have no faith in that coaching selection? And I believe most people are in agreement. Do you think the fans are stupid? Good luck with your decisions. Okay, so with this one, um, we did touch on this before in another podcast, but we'll mention it again. Um, David Quinn has no bearing on the development of certain players. Okay, assistant coaches come here to do the job that they're tasked. And for all intents and purposes, David Quinn had a very good power play with Pittsburgh. And obviously, the Rangers' power play was a huge issue last season, which could have really, um, if they really had the power play going to a degree, things would be a bit better. But the one thing that we have to understand, I understand that David Quinn has a bad rap here. Is he a good head coach? Probably not. But assistant coaches are not in the same level as head coaches. The head coach of the team is the one that's really going to be the head guy. So all the decisions are going to be his at the end of the day. And we all know that Mike Sullivan has a good track record in using young guys, developing young guys. I mean, he made the most of Jake Gensel, Brian Rust, Connor Sheary, all those guys that would be no names elsewhere. He made use of them. So I trust Mike Sullivan's judgment in that aspect. David Quinn's not going to have an issue or is not going to be involved in a lot of what the organization is going to do with the young players. So I don't see him being a problem. He's just there to draw up an offense and just kind of coach them into the offense. David Quinn had a really good power play with the Penguins. The Penguins were worse than the Rangers statistically on the record, but their power play was so much better. Granted, it was with Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, but the Rangers don't. It's not like the Rangers have slouches with Trochet, with Panarin, Zibanejad, Miller, you know, Lafreniere. Those guys are not slouches. The Rangers have talent, so he will do well as an offensive coach. Sometimes just because they were a defensive player doesn't exactly mean that they can't be offensive. You just have to understand the system. So while I do understand why fans would feel that way, we also have to understand that David Quinn's not going to be making big decisions like he did when he was head coach. And certainly I don't think Mike Sullivan or Chris Drury will allow him to have, a huge say on things outside of just kind of asking for his input. But he won't get a final decision. He's not gonna be, you know, this sort of, you know, he's not gonna be a huge decision maker, you know. I just if they do, then that's on them. But, I just don't think that they're really going to he's gonna make much of a difference outside of doing the power play. And honestly, if the power play comes in and does well because of David Quinn, by all means. It wasn't working under, you know, Michael Pekka. Obviously a lot of that comes from personnel, of course, but sometimes a change needed to be made and needed to be made. And also Joe Sacco has a really good track record of being a defensive head coach or a defensive coach. And I think he'll do well with, I mean, these guys basically work with Sullivan. So I think he'll do well. And Ty Hennis too, also very highly regarded coach in the Pittsburgh Penguins system, really added a lot of, you know, just it. He was an assistant coach and he was a skills development coach and um, was really a big part of just kind of getting the Penguins players out there. So I'm willing to trust Sullivan's judgment and the organization's judgment on just using these guys as assistants. What they had last season didn't work, so I'm willing to kind of see what they do here with that. Next question. Let's see. I know there's one more here. There's two more rather. I'm gonna save the food one for last, as we always do. This is from Captain Jack. So thank you for submitting a question. Now, by the way, I'm just letting you guys know, when I read these off of the website, I'm basically going from the top down. So I guess the more, maybe I can sort this out. Um, so, oh, and look at that. We just got another question submitted as I was recording this. I'll touch on that too. So let me go back to Captain Jack just to make sure I get this right. So thank you, Captain Jack, and thank you, Earth yourself, for all of your questions. We appreciate it. Hopefully, I did the best that I can to try and answer all of those. And please keep submitting those. We love answering these questions. Captain Jack. All right. So, Captain Jack, you ask, throughout salary cap, throughout what might be required to give up in a trade, if you could add two players to this upcoming team in the entire NHL, who would it be and why? Well, I think I already mentioned it. I mean, it's Connor McDavid and then Cale Makar. Um, either or it could be Connor McDavid, or just get me, another depth defenseman, or even just get me another winger, you know. But definitely Connor McDavid, if not McDavid, Jack Eichel. Ideally Alexander Barkov, which I think was mentioned in one of the comments here. That's also another ideal thing, but um, I think the more likely scenario would be Connor McDavid. Um, I know you mentioned Captain Jack that Jacob Slavin would be good. I would 100% take that because then you could put Slavin with Fox and then move Gavrikov to another lower pair and then just kind of have everybody else drop a spot. Have Vakanainen and Morrow as sort of depth. So yeah, that's how I see that. So I definitely do agree with McDavid and Slavin, but I think if you said anyone in the entire NHL, it would definitely be McDavid and Cale Makar. Sounds very NHL 25, but I think Cale Makar, who was actually a free agent, which I don't think he'll make it, but I would definitely pick him. This question comes from Blue Shirts. This was added as I'm recording this podcast, and they thank you, Blue Shirts, and also thank you, Captain Jack, for your comment or for your question. And Blue Shirts asks, Cooley, Miller, Zibanejad top line to start the season. 100% would do that. I think they played a little bit towards the end of the season, and they had a couple of good games together, or the times that they were on the ice together, and then that would allow for it would be Panarin, Trocheck, and Lafreniere. But then you also have to wonder: do you value Brendan Othman over Will Cooley? I think definitely Will Cooley has played enough to where he could be on the top line. Will Cooley is definitely more of a younger style Chris Kreider without the elite speed. But they do play very similar style game. Um, but I wouldn't be against it, you know. Um, definitely means that if you have Will Cooley starting as your top line left wing, then obviously it'll be Cooley, Miller, and Zibanejad, and then it would be Trocheck, Panarin, and Lafreniere, and then the third line would essentially be sort of like Berard, Parsonen, or Brodzinski and Othman, which I think would be pretty good. So you just hope that these players can live up to their potential, though. This is sort of a make or break season for Othman, but I like that. Cooley, Miller, and Zibanejad as the top line to start the season. I wouldn't be against it. Honestly, I wouldn't be against it. And I know I'm sounding very agreeable, but it's really hard to make a determination when we really haven't seen much yet. And finally, our last question would be from Two Line Passes. I love these. Keep sending these. I mean, these are great. Uh, Two Line Passes asks, if a cannibal ate a vegetarian, would they be considered grass fed? Goodness gracious. I had my eye on this question and then I noticed it, but then I decided to actually read it out, and it's actually way funnier than I thought. I mean, I don't even. It's 12:37 a.m. right now on August 8th. I genuinely don't know how to answer this. I want to give like a joke answer, but at the same time, I'm actually sitting down and actually thinking about how could this be an actual possibility. It just shows where my head is at. Um, if a cannibal ate a vegetarian, would they be considered grass fed? Oh gosh. Um, I'm really trying to answer this, even if it's on the jokey side. I'm actually trying to see if I can come up with an answer for this. Um, you know what? I'm going to plead the fifth on that. I know it's kind of a cop out, but I think that's hilarious. Thank you for that. And then Magnar X followed a comment, says no, they would be considered cannibal fed, which was 17 minutes ago of to this recording. And then another NYC Crash responded, duh, they would be considered a cannibal as even the grass-fed vegetarian is still meat. Now, if you would ask a cannibal to eat some, it would be animal abuse. Whoa, okay. I caught myself on that, but yeah, that's funny. Um, so yeah, so thank you for your questions. Also, I just want to point out on the question by Earth Yourself about the head coaches, Magnar X said that's easy. All those three are of a French ancestry, while Sullivan is Irish. Well, I just hope that doesn't blow up in their faces. So, I'm just combing just to make sure that I didn't miss anything. And if I did miss your question, I sincerely apologize. But I'm just combing through to make sure that there is nothing missed. And I think we've touched all of these questions here. Let me just double check Twitter just to make sure. Hoping to get some more interactions on Twitter. I think we have a pretty big base on there, so we've been posting consistently on it. So I'm hoping that we can get more on that platform as well. But we still get some decent traction on our socials, and we thank you for that. We really do appreciate it. So I honestly think that's about it. I don't foresee anything else here. Again, if I missed anything, please feel free to toss it on our next post or comment or another social media post. I just have to comb through just to make sure, because I don't want to miss any questions. It would kill me. Okay, so I answered that one. Oh, no, okay, I think we're good. So again, thank you everyone for submitting your questions. It really makes these summer podcasts a lot better. Because I know last year, um, you know, we kind of didn't really utilize the blog for questions, and obviously it being the summer, um, with the team, kind of crashing out against the Panthers, it was, wasn't as, interactive, so to speak. So a lot of the summer episodes were really just me ranting at like 2 o'clock in the morning. but but no, we thank you for your submissions. It makes these so much better to record. We love answering your questions. It adds a whole nother depth to this podcast, and we want to make sure that we are in touch with you guys as much as possible, because you are again the lifeblood of not only the blog but just also this podcast, because we wouldn't be able to do any of this if it wasn't for you guys, the Patreon subscribers, and anyone who just kind of tunes in and listens to what we're able to provide. So we're approaching about the 1 hour mark, and again, thank you for taking the time out to answer some of these questions, or to send some of these questions, excuse me. And I'm glad, and I know Dave and Rob and everyone else, we're glad to answer them, and we appreciate your engagement with the website. I haven't really written much lately. There really isn't much to write about. I'm trying not to do as many retrospectives. I want to make sure that those aren't diluting the website, or too much. I know I was churning those out a lot at some point, but I want to make sure that when I put out those retrospectives that they're pretty good. But anyways, I want to thank you all for your questions. We appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have Dave and Rob back here next week. But if anything, continue to submit your questions and we'll have some more hockey content for you next week. So this is producer JL from Life in the Blue Seats saying thank you so much for listening and let's go Rangers.